Περνούμε τώρα στην δεύτερη συνεδρία της σημερινής ημέρας, στην οποία θα ξεκινήσουμε με την εισήγηση του καθηγητή κυρίου Halvor Moxnes, ομότιμου καθηγητή του Πανεπιστημίου του Όσλο, ο οποίος έχει ειδίκευση στην θεματική που μας απασχολεί, δηλαδή στην σχέση Βίβλου και Πολιτικής και ευρύτερα στην κοινωνιολογική προσέγγιση της Καινής Διαθήκης. Professor Moxnes, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be here present with us. We are very honored, and you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here and grateful for the invitation, and sorry that I have to speak in a language that is foreign to both you and me. But let's try. The question implied in this title, Jesus and the Politics of the Kingdom of God, must first be addressed. To biblical scholars, what are the politics of our readings of Jesus and the kingdom? At the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature, the largest group of international biblical scholars in the world, met in November, and it took stock of the presidential address 30 years ago by the leading feminist New Testament scholar in the world today, Elisabeth Fiorenza. Her address then was The Ethics of Biblical Interpretation, Decentering Biblical Scholarship. And she pointed out that before she gave her address in 1987, there had been no mention of Holocaust, other political issues, human rights, civil rights movement in the States, or liberation movements in Latin America. So she felt it was high time to address the political question of what is it to interpret the Bible. And particularly since the Bible has over the centuries had such an influence on the political situation in Western societies, it was high time for biblical scholars to reflect on their role. And the task, she said, was to acknowledge the political influence of the Bible and to bring its moral and anthropological resources to bear on the challenges for humanity. So, interpretation must combine the historical study of the Bible with the consequences, implications for the Bible in society today. I will take as examples of two such readings of the Bible two Roman Catholic theologians, John Fullenbach, who wrote The Kingdom of God, The Message of Jesus Today, and John Sobrino, Jesus the Liberator. Fullenbach sees the kingdom as the religious symbols of our time, and he sees several urgent topics that Christian churches must address and to come with grips with, such as the horizon against which we must proclaim the vision of Jesus, the kingdom of God. Among these are solidarity with the poor, the immense problem of refugees and immigration, inculturation and dialogue with other religions and worldviews. Fullenbach wrote more than 20 years ago, but the problems he mentioned are more urgent than ever in Europe today. From his Latin American perspective, John Sobrino starts his Jesus the Liberator from the historical position of Jesus. At the time of Sobrino's writing in the 1990s, the message of Jesus and his activities were mostly considered in a religious sense only. And in contrast, Sobrino sees religious, social, economic, and political contexts as part of one integrated whole. And this is especially significant in the way he contrasts the kingdom of God with the anti-kingdom a new term that Sobrino uses to great effect. He starts with the miracles of Jesus as signs of the kingdom. And these signs are not only beneficence for the individuals, but they are also liberating signs, liberation from oppression. And this becomes most visible in Jesus casting out of demons, who represent the anti-kingdom. And in order to understand these miracles as liberating signs, Sobrino says, we have to put ourselves in the historical setting in which they happened, the world of the poor. Their world was characterized by disease, fear of demons, and mental illnesses that kept people in slavery. Sobrino describes the poor as those who have all the powers of this world against them, oligarchies, governments, armed forces, party politics, and sometimes churches and cultural institutions. Here Sobrino brings together the historical situation of the poor at the time of Jesus and the poor in Latin America at his own time. With their perspectives, Fullenbach and Sobrino emphasizes the social structure within which the kingdom was proclaimed. That was the anti-kingdom of suffering of the poor, refugees and immigrants. This clearly is a political context. Do we find a similar political context in the Gospels and the history of Jesus? We can start with the very terminology of the kingdom of God. The Gospel used the terms basileia for kingdom. The parallel word for king or ruler is basileus. These are political terms used of the rulers and the kingdoms of the Hellenistic world. In his farewell speech in Luke 22, Jesus explicitly criticizes the kings of the Gentiles who lord over the people and who falsely call themselves benefactors. In contrast, in the kingdom of God, the relations between God and people were of a different type. So we must look for the social structures of the kingdom in Jesus' proclamation. This is a different question than to see the kingdom primarily from an interest in time. That was the dominant way to see the kingdom that made eschatology the almost exclusive context for discussions of the kingdom of God. Recently, however, this focus on time has been challenged. In the last part of the 20th century, historical and literary studies of the Bible were expanded with an interaction with social sciences, particularly sociology and social anthropology. This led to an interest in social relations and structures and the place where events happened. And that may lead to a shift from the question, when does the kingdom come, to what kind of place is the kingdom? Jesus' sayings about kingdom spans a variety of genres: parables, exhortations, discussions, wisdom's words, with a variety of images. Many of these images describe social events and relations. For instance, a meal, a party, a wedding. I suggest that these images of the kingdom of God may be compared to literary works on imaginary places. This has been a popular genre in literature from Homer and Plato to our own days. In early modernity, there were a number of works that describe an ideal world. They are often named utopias. It was first used by the English philosopher Thomas More in a book by that name in 1516. The book was More's criticism of of contemporary society in England. It described human life, society, and institutions in an ideal utopian place as the opposite of England in his time. So it was a criticism of the injustice of the situation in England. So is it possible to see in the Gospels an aspect of this, a criticism of the present situation in Galilee at the time of Jesus? What type of place was Galilee? The ruler, Herod Antipas, was a son of Herod the Great and had authority over Galilee. He established or re-established 2 towns, Sepphoris and Tiberias, and they were the center of his control of the area and also of the economy. And Herod introduced what we, with a modern terminology, might call a market economy that served the domination and the control of land by the elite. The result was a disaster for the peasant small householders. And many of Jesus' parables speak to this situation when he speaks of death, poverty, the lack of possibility to pay rents. So it indicates a breakdown of the local communities and their kinship structure. And the Beatitudes of Jesus in Luke 6 give a description of this anti-kingdom for the poor, the sick, and those who wept. And it presents the kingdom as a reversal of their situation. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Jesus' confrontation with the rich, those who are filled, those who are happy, follows a pattern that we know from the prophets in the Old Testament, of God who acts on behalf of the poor and who reverses the fortunes of the rich and wealthy. Now, Jesus was placed in that role. So Jesus' words was a protest against the economic policy that created poverty. I use the term economy in the broad sense of oikonomia, that is, householding of resources of all kinds, social, economic, political, and religious. Luke's Gospel describes the system of social and economic policy in Galilee with a terminology used in the Hellenistic world of exchange. To lend and to be repaid, to invite and to be re-invited in return. The ideal was balanced reciprocity, the attempt to reach equivalence between what is given and what is received. This model of exchange applied to all sorts of social interaction. In Luke 14, Jesus criticizes this form of exchange between the well-to-do. It was based on inviting the friends or brothers or relatives or rich neighbors. That is, it was an interaction between those who had resources that left the poor outside the system. So, therefore, Jesus set up an alternative to invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. And he relieved the poor of any expectations to repay, since God took upon himself to repay. So, the kingdom of God is described as a place with a different system of exchange and of relations between people. Anthropologists call this generalized exchange, an altruistic mode without expectations of a quick return. Another way to describe the kingdom of the gospel are Jesus' healings and exorcisms. They have long been interpreted in the Western world as individual experiences of mental illnesses. But this is inadequate to understand the meaning in the Middle Eastern context. And there are societies today where we can find similar, broader understanding of being possessed. The term in Africa of Jesus, the African healer, points to a situation where not only individual people are ill, but the society as such is described as sick. And in Latin America, studies of shamanism, for example in Colombia, show that possessions by the evil spirits could be caused by forces of colonization and to then Indians' loss of control over the land. They lost everything that supported them. And then, as a counter movement, was shamanism, where the shamans regained in a subtle way, in a deeper meaning, the control of the land. Against this background, it's possible to see Jesus' exorcisms, which he explained as done by the finger of God, as a sign that the kingdom of God has come to you. If Galilee was under the anti-kingdom of Satan, with his exorcisms, Jesus had brought it back under the kingdom of God. This confrontation between evil forces and God spanned the world. In Luke 16:13, Jesus speaks of the confrontation between God and Mammon, a name that sums up the spiritual, economic, and political forces of anti-kingdom. So what is the challenge of reading and interpreting the kingdom of God today? I suggest that the key to a reading of the kingdom of God that is relevant for today is to see that Jesus' proclamation of the kingdom stands in contrast to the anti-kingdom. This is a difficult term to understand. It seems very strange. So I would suggest an interpretation, another name for anti-kingdom, and that is business as usual within the neoliberal economy of the world. In Galilee, as in our time, the structures of anti-kingdom was business as usual for the rich, for all those who benefited from the system. Is it that system that is challenged today with immigration, refugees, homeless people? But have you noticed that when the situation is described, it is not described as a problem for the homeless, for refugees, for immigrants. It is described as a crisis for Europe, because it's a crisis for the economic system of Europe. And this crisis has been met by more politics as usual, of social, economic, and political systems that protect the haves, the rich, against the poor. And the danger, I think, is for biblical scholars and for Christians in general to accept this business as usual as given. And we hide it from the criticism of the kingdom of God. But Jesus' kingdom is not a comfortable hope for the future of a world that continues with business as usual. We may say that the kingdom of God is not a political program, but it has political effects in the way it criticizes unjust systems. And its utopian vision will change the mentalities and change the way we understand the world. And I think that the kingdom as a utopian vision by Jesus will create hope that it is possible to see the world from the perspective of the poor. That an economy of generosity is possible, and that it is possible to include those who today have no place. And I hope that to hold up such a vision of the kingdom will help us to move away from business as usual. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Moxnes, for providing us with a fresh perspective, not only on the witness of the New Testament, about the notion of kingdom of God, but also on how such notions can help and can shed some new light on today's situations, political situations, and today's political crisis in Europe and also in a global scale. Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ τον καθηγητή, τον κύριο Moxnes, για αυτήν την συναρπαστική περιήγηση στον κόσμο της Γαλιλαίας, της εποχής του Χριστού, αλλά και ευρύτερα στον αρχαίο ελληνορωμαϊκό κόσμο και ελληνιστικό κόσμο, και για τις αναλογίες που έκανε μεταξύ της τότε κατάστασης και της σύγχρονης κρίσης, και για το πώς ένας χριστιανός μπορεί να τοποθετηθεί με βάση την μαρτυρία της βίβλου απέναντι στις σημερινές προκλήσεις.